Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom, hoping that everyone is well. We're going to be talking about Japheth and Jacob. Now we're going to be approaching this from a vantage point that is not typically approached, and we are going to be looking at both of them historically as what are known as supplanters. Now some people do understand Jacob as the supplanter. Many people, however, do not also understand Japheth in that same context. And so we're going to look at the etymology of both of these names and then some ancient historical dynamics with respect to this supplanting dynamic, and then some modern dynamics with respect to this supplanting dynamic. And so if you don't know what supplanting means, we're going to also cover that so that that is more clear. And so we've gone over this before, but we're going to cover this in a little bit more nuanced detail here. And so you see the name Jacob. You don't see the J, of course, here, but you see the Y. And Jacob is understood as a son of Isaac and also his descendants. Now, this is interesting because you often see Esau identified in terms of that name as a son of Isaac. And so this can be kind of confusing because Isaac's son is tied to Sack's son. But however, this is the initial understanding of the name Jacob. And here is Strong's Exhaustive Concordance expounding on what this name Jacob means. And it has a couple of spellings for Jacob, interestingly, but it indicates that it's from the Akob, and it means heel catcher or supplanter. And there are a couple of spellings here that are interesting. And then a qualifier, and it's indicating that Jacob with the Jaakob is the Israelitish patriarch. It's almost like a negation of Jacob's progenitor status by having that ISH at the end. So it's unclear what that's all about, but also so that you remember that Jacob is also Iakov in terms of betacism, with the V and the B being interchangeable. So just remember that. And just as a quick sidetrack here so that you'll know, this word Israelitish was first recorded in the 1500s, and it says of or relating to the Israelites. And this is again very odd because Jacob would not be Israelitish because he is supposed to be Israel. So we've talked about that name before. You might want to go back and reference that. And so that you'll have clarity as we move into talking about Japheth, I want you to understand what supplanting is all about. And supplanting, which is Jacob's name, means to supersede another, especially by force or treachery, to eradicate another, or be a substitute for another person, to take the place of another person. Now, some people try to make this whole dynamic very benign, particularly if they are identifying as a descendant of Jacob. They attempt to make this whole process very benign, but there's nothing benign about stealing the blessing, the inheritance of the sibling. And so that's what took place. And if you know anything about wills and trust, you know that when something like that takes place, that the property that was taken would usually go back to the person that it was intended for. But we're not going to get into that now. What we are going to get into is the first supplanter, which is Japheth. Now, on the surface, when you are first looking at Japheth, there is nothing to indicate that Japheth means supplanter. But as we go on, you're going to see as we break this down that we are basically talking about the same dynamic. And so here you see Japheth, again, Japheth is a son of Noah. And again, that J is missing because it wasn't even there originally. Most understandings of Japheth stop at this idea of expansion. And so when people talk about Japheth or his blessing, they indicate that it means expansion. Japheth means expansion, means enlargement. And this is also supposed to apply to his children. And this is where this starts to veer off a little bit. So when you look at that root for Japheth, that pa, tha, what you come up with is not just to be spacious, but at the root of it is this idea of allure. And so that gives this a different perspective in terms of what this name is suggesting. And so usually, again, when people are thinking about Japheth, they are just usually thinking about expansion or enlargement, just those words, but not how that expansion or how that enlargement takes place. And here we have Strong's Concordance expounding on this name that means enlarge and giving more nuance to it. And so you see at the root of it, it says a primitive root, meaning to open, to make room. And it says either, figuratively or literally here. But it also means to do this in a sinister way, a way that is deluding, alluring, deceiving, enticing, flattering, persuading. And so this enlarging and this expansion is not just a general natural process that just involves the idea of Japheth, but this idea of Japheth, this expansion, this enlargement is something that apparently takes place in the same way as supplanting. And so you have this merging in terms of how Japheth, that root Japheth, and that root of Jacob, you have this merging in terms of what is really going on with these names. And so you can see both of them involve this idea of treachery, supplanting, taking something, moving into the space of another, taking the place of another, but doing so through deception. And this is just a continuation of that discussion about the root of Japheth, to be spacious, wide open. It also adds this idea of gossip to it. Now, what has added to this confusion, of course, is this whole phenotype dynamic where you have people grouped together according to phenotype versus their genetics versus clan relationships. You have these people just lumped together based upon skin color for the most part. It's not even really the whole phenotype. And so Japheth has been lumped together with Ham and Shem, whether you're talking about light people or dark people. And so it's very difficult to disentangle that when that is the paradigm for identity. However, just as people, groups of people, name places, geographic spaces after themselves or after their ancestors, they also retain the names of the ancestors. And you're going to see that contrary to many opinions, Japheth is embedded in Africa. That's not to say that that's the only place that Japheth is located, because we've talked about Japheth before, and so Japheth is also located in islands. But it's important for this discussion, as we are leading to a particular point in terms of modern history, it's important to understand that this name is deeply rooted in Africa. So this idea of expansion, this idea of moving into and enlarging another space, this is important to Africa, and it's important to the idea of imperialism. And one of the things that happens is people often forget or ignore that people in Africa have engaged in imperialism, whether they have come from Europe and then gone down into Africa with imperialism mandates, or whether they have been in the East and then come into Africa with these imperialism mandates. But you have significant imperialism, you have significant expansion, you have significant supplanting of the Aboriginal people in Africa through this entire dynamic. And so you see here with this name Japheth that the majority of people with this name are in Tanzania, Nigeria, Kenya. And so you see the largest percentage in Tanzania, but you also see that individuals are also in Vanuatu. Now, you also have individuals naming their children Japheth. And there's also a preponderance of this going on in Africa. And so you see it is a male name meaning the extender, one of Noah's sons. Now, this name, you see 29,000 individuals bearing this first name, and it's most prevalent in Kenya. And so the holding on to this identity is most prevalent in Kenya, followed by Tanzania, Nigeria, Ghana, and then you have some in the Philippines, and then you see the rest of the places. But there is a heavy presence in Africa. And given the population of the United States, you don't have as many in the United States. But you have a significant number in Jamaica, given the population of Jamaica. The population of Jamaica is not that large, and so that's a significant number of individuals identifying as Japheth or identifying their children as Japheth in Jamaica. As an additional note, what's interesting about the Jamaica Japheth dynamic is that historically, Ireland, some groups in Ireland have understood themselves as being Japhetic. Now, of course, there's always the playing around with letters. And so you also see Japheth or Japhet without the H on the end, and you have 74,000 people bearing this surname. Again, you have primarily 42,000 in Tanzania, 11,000 in Nigeria, 9,000 in Burundi, you see in Chad. Interestingly, you have over 2,600 individuals in Israel with this surname Japhet, then going on into Kenya. Now, we've looked at some of the etymology dynamics that tie Japheth and Jacob together in terms of the meanings. And we also see that there is significant presence of Japheth in Africa. Now, this is in contrast to the discussion about Shem being this major presence in Africa. However, what's going on often is there is so much obscuring of Japheth for whatever reason that it's very difficult to always pinpoint exactly where Japheth is at any particular point in history. There's also an indication that certain groups in Ireland were understood as Japheth. And so, but what we're going to be doing now is quickly looking at how Japheth is understood in the context of Ife in West Africa. And we're going to be looking at this dynamic of expansion and imperialism that has been largely overlooked. Now, one individual did comment that it's incorrect to lump all Yoruba people together because the Yoruba people, apparently, according to this one individual, they come from different roots, basically. And so you have all of these branches, but different roots. And so the different groups of people in Yoruba land need to be understood as different people. Now, historically, it was said that the Fulani perhaps gave them this name, Yoruba, which when you look at it and you delve into it, it really leads to the word Arabia, Arab, meaning mixed. And so that does go along with what the individual was saying, that Yoruba in and of itself is this culmination of a mixture of people, sort of the consummate Arabs. Their name means Arab. They are the Arabs. And so not only do we have this presence of the name Japheth in Africa, both East Africa and West Africa, heavy presence in East Africa, however, but you have this manifestation of this name in terms of the root in West Africa in the Ife. And you can see here that Ife basically is the same as Japheth, meaning enlarge or to expand. And you can see the root of it in the middle of that paragraph. It's also interesting to note that the ram is considered the most important animal that is offered to Oduduwa. Now, most people might tend to think of the Ife as only occupying Nigeria. However, you will find individuals all throughout that west coast of Africa, and you will also find people, Ife, Yoruba people all over the world, consistent with that idea of enlarge and expand. And this is an article that talks about this expansionist dynamic. And it talks about the origins of the Yoruba people and how they came from one land to where they are now. And the belief is that they came from Mecca. Now, this coincides with some of the history of the Moors, that coming from Arabia theory. And so what's interesting here when you start talking about expansion and enlarging is that the Yoruba brought with them from where they came to that west coast of Africa their religion, and they brought it to the Aborigines in that particular space. Now, many of the original people that were there were moved south. They were conquered and moved south, and so that would be your South Africans. But for the ones that remained, there was this, again, supplanting and enlarging to the point where you don't really know who the Aboriginal people are as an onlooker. You don't know who the Aboriginal people are and who the Yoruba are because there has been this coalescing in many ways. It's also important to note here that in contrast to this idea of a mixture of people, you have this assertion that Yoruba is actually a race. And so that actually goes against this idea of this is not one unified entity. And so you have the Yoruba understood as a race, and that Oduduwa was the progenitor of a variety of royal dynasties in Yoruba land. And here you have additional discussion about this branch of Japheth coming out of Mecca, leaving Arabia, and moving because of a clash related to religion. And this is a very interesting dynamic that has taken place with respect to this expansion idea and moving into the space of another. There is a lot, by the way, of this dynamic going on in scripture, of people moving into the lands of other people, taking lands, taking cultures, putting on the identities of other people. It's so pervasive. It's incredible that anyone would know who they happen to be, or that they would still be holding on to names. It's just really incredible because of this dynamic of people moving in and taking over the lands of others. And this is going on throughout history, period. So you have all of these Roman conquests and these British conquests. You have all of these conquests of people moving in and taking things that do not belong to them. And then claiming it for themselves. So anyway, what you have here is a kingdom, a Yoruba kingdom that is actually in South Carolina, and you see the godheads that are on that property. And so what this reminds of is in history, 100 years from now, someone may actually go to this location and use this as proof that perhaps the Yoruba people were the original people of that land. The same thing with the Olmecs. Nobody really knows exactly how those Olmecs came to be there, or Mount Rushmore. So you can use all of these artifacts to paint any kind of picture you want, because again, it's the people looking back and presuming what these artifacts might have meant at that time. As we wrap this up, one thing I want to call to your attention is the phenotype that is presented. And so you see here with this phenotype that this is a phenotype that is diverse in terms of its presentation. So you see bits and pieces of this phenotype all over the world, whether you're talking about light people or dark people. You see bits of this phenotype all over the world. It's a very, what you would consider now, a very stereotypical Asiatic phenotype. And you also see the epicanthic fold apparent in this particular phenotype. And so this is a phenotype that is shared with people in the East, in the West, the North, and the South. And so it is a very dispersed phenotype. As we wrap this up, I want to bring something to your attention, something for you to think about. There has been a normalization of this supplanting dynamic throughout history. And people will often just say, hey, that's just the way things are. And people are not upset about the supplanting dynamic unless they are the victims of it. But what has also taken place is when people are the perpetrators of this supplanting dynamic, there is a minimizing of the impact of this on other people. And so you see this with all forms of imperialism. The supplanters, whether we're talking about Jacob or Japheth or any other entity at this point, there is a tendency to ignore the impact of the supplanting, and but a focus on harms that have been done to those individuals. So you will see individuals who have been supplanted complain about being supplanted, but not having the same type of empathy and sympathy that would be expected when they are the recipients of the supplanting. And so that is definitely something that people need to think about. Think about treating others the way that you want to be treated, or even better than the way you want to be treated. But also acknowledging that sometimes a number of people around the world right now are the recipients of ill-gotten gain. They have land and resources that really don't belong to them. But they are very quick to identify when they themselves have been harmed. And so we're talking about these two groups right now with Jacob and Japheth. There may be a very quick move to identify being harmed or wronged or displaced, but not the same level of empathy that should be there for those who have been victimized perhaps by their own ancestors. And so just food for thought. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.